The night never truly belonged to the desert, yet on that summer evening it felt as if the sands themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The heat of the day had not disappeared with the sun. It lingered in the air, wrapping every breath in a heavy cloak, while the dunes shimmered under the pale glow of the moon. Far away, where the horizon melted into silence, a faint vibration pulsed, almost like the heartbeat of the earth. It was not the usual whisper of wind through the dunes, nor the distant cry of jackals. This was something else, something mechanical, something menacing. And anyone who listened closely enough would have realized. It was the hum of German engines being tested, a reminder that even in the emptiness of North Africa, war had built its nest. For weeks, the rumors had spread among British troops stationed near Tobruk. Whispers of a secret Luftwaffe testing ground, hidden somewhere beyond the cracked wadis and endless dunes. A place where new aircraft were arriving, faster and deadlier than anything yet seen in the skies of Africa. The idea that Rommel's men might soon command such machines was a nightmare too dark to ignore. That was why a small group of men, whose names never found their way into most history books, were preparing to do something no one else dared to attempt. They were not the kind of soldiers who marched in formation or stood tall during parades. These were saboteurs, specialists in shadows and silence, men trained to disappear into the night and return only with stories so strange and unbelievable that even their comrades doubted them. Their leader, a wiry captain named Edward Mallory, carried himself not with pride but with the kind of tired confidence only men who had seen too much could muster. Mallory had fought in Europe before being sent to the desert, and though his eyes carried a quiet melancholy, his mind was sharp as a blade. The group moved under the cover of darkness, each man wrapped in desert robes that concealed their uniforms, sand clinging to their boots, weapons carried with the casual familiarity of men who had long ago stopped thinking of them as tools but rather as extensions of their own bodies. Their mission was simple in writing, yet impossibly dangerous in reality. Infiltrate the German airfield, destroy the aircraft being tested, ignite the fuel depots, and steal whatever intelligence they could carry before disappearing into the desert. As they trudged across the sands, the sound of engines grew clearer until it was no longer a whisper but a low, constant growl. The German base lay ahead, nestled between two shallow ridges, its outline faint yet unmistakable. From a distance, they could already make out the silhouettes of planes lined up like sleeping beasts, their wings catching the moonlight. Some of them looked familiar, Messerschmitt fighters, their noses sharp like predators poised to strike. But others seemed strange, bulkier, with shapes that suggested new designs. Those were the machines the British command feared most. The saboteurs paused, crouching low behind a dune as Mallory raised a small pair of binoculars. The glass revealed what the naked eye could not. Guards pacing along the perimeter, spotlights sweeping the sands, fuel barrels stacked like towers of death waiting to explode. It was a fortress built not of walls but of vigilance, and any misstep would mean certain death. Yet Mallory lowered the binoculars with a calm expression. He knew the risk, and he knew the price. There was no turning back. The men began their crawl forward, bellies pressed against the warm sand, every movement slow and deliberate. The desert has a way of amplifying the smallest sound, and each shuffle of cloth, each click of a pebble beneath their weight, felt like thunder in their ears. They reached the outer fence, a thin line of barbed wire that seemed more symbolic than effective. Mallory motioned for one of the men, a wiry Scot named Fraser, to cut a narrow gap. Fraser's hands moved quickly, practiced, the metal giving way with a quiet snap. They slid through one by one, slipping into the lion's den. Inside the perimeter, the smell of fuel hit them like a wave, sharp and intoxicating, mixed with the faint odor of grease and metal. Shadows danced under the pale beams of spotlights, and the men moved with the patience of hunters. Their targets were clear, the unfamiliar aircraft at the far end of the runway, the stacked barrels of fuel, and the small command hut where intelligence might be found. It would have been easy to lose oneself in the tension of the moment, to let fear dictate every movement, but Mallory and his men carried with them something stronger than fear. They carried the knowledge that what they did here tonight could alter the course of the desert war, that by destroying these machines they might grant their comrades in the field a fighting chance. That thought burned brighter than fear, and it guided their hands as they set the charges, wired the detonators, and prepared the stage for destruction. Still, the desert is a place of betrayals, and as one of the men, a tall fellow named Hargreaves, crept toward the command hut, he froze at the sound of boots striking gravel. A German patrol appeared, two men with rifles slung casually, their conversation carried in low tones. Hargreaves pressed himself against the shadows, heart pounding, sweat running into his eyes. The patrol passed within arm's reach, oblivious to the saboteur hidden in darkness. He waited until their footsteps faded before slipping forward again, his resolve hardened by the close call. Mallory signaled the others to retreat to their rally point once the charges were set. They moved silently, but just as the last of them slipped past the fuel depot, the unexpected happened. A flare shot into the sky, painting the desert in harsh red glow. Someone had seen something. Maybe a shadow too sharp, a movement too sudden. German voices erupted, shouts of alarm carrying across the airfield. Spotlights swung wildly, sweeping across sand and steel. The saboteurs had no choice now but to act. Mallory pressed the detonator, and the night exploded. The roar was deafening, flames leaping high into the sky as barrels of fuel ignited one after another, sending fire rolling across the base. The strange new aircraft were consumed in the inferno, their frames twisting in the heat. Chaos swept through the German ranks as soldiers scrambled, shouting orders drowned by the roar of fire and the thunder of secondary blasts. The saboteurs ran, sprinting across the open sands as the base descended into madness. Tracer fire cut through the night, bullets hissing past like angry insects, but the desert offered its own cover, dunes swallowing the men as they vanished into the darkness. Behind them, the sky glowed with fire, a beacon of destruction that would be seen for miles. Yet as the group regrouped in the safety of the dunes, Mallory's sharp eyes caught something in the distance. Not all of the German aircraft had been destroyed. A single, strange silhouette remained untouched, parked at the far edge of the base, its shape different from the others, almost like a predator crouching in wait. And in the chaos, as flames consumed everything else, that lone machine stood intact, guarded fiercely by soldiers who seemed more desperate to save it than themselves. Mallory knew then that the raid was far from over. Something about that aircraft was worth more than fuel, more than planes, more even than lives. And if the Germans were so desperate to protect it, then it might be the very key the British command had been searching for. The desert wind carried the echo of explosions into the night, but amid the fire and smoke, one question burned hotter than the flames. Would Mallory and his men dare to return for the machine that still stood? And if they did, would any of them live to tell the tale? The desert never gave second chances, and as the first wave of explosions tore through the German airfield, Edward Mallory and his men knew that what they had already achieved would echo across the war. Yet the inferno they had unleashed did not feel like victory, not entirely. Through the haze of fire and smoke, the captain's eyes had caught that single aircraft standing untouched at the edge of the base, a dark silhouette shaped unlike anything he had seen before, guarded by men who seemed to care more for it than their own lives. The destruction of fuel depots and the annihilation of familiar Messerschmitts was important, but the fact that this strange machine remained whole gnawed at Mallory's mind with a persistence that would not be silenced. It was not just instinct, it was the kind of cold intuition born of experience, the kind that told him the Germans were gambling everything on this hidden jewel. And so, even as the flames roared behind them and tracer rounds raked the dunes, the captain's thoughts were already bending toward the impossible, to return to the heart of chaos and claim what the enemy was so desperate to protect. The men had regrouped a few hundred yards from the airfield, their chests heaving, sand sticking to sweat-soaked faces, each one silently calculating how close they had come to death already. Fraser spat into the sand, muttering something about the devil himself watching over them, while Hargreaves leaned forward, his hands on his knees, his body trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. These were men who understood the cost of hesitation, men who knew that each heartbeat carried with it the weight of fate. Yet none of them were prepared for what their captain was about to suggest. When Mallory finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, but carried the kind of authority that made men listen even when they wished they could not. He told them what he had seen, that lone aircraft standing untouched, guarded as if it were treasure, and though every instinct in them screamed to keep moving, to disappear into the night and let the flames speak for themselves, they understood immediately that he was right. The mission was not complete. Not yet. What lay ahead was madness, and they all knew it. To return to a base already in flames, swarming with panicked soldiers, with the enemy on full alert, was as close to suicide as war could offer. Yet something about Mallory's conviction bound them tighter than fear could unravel. They had already risked everything, and perhaps it was the desert itself that pressed on their spirits, whispering that if they walked away now, history would remember only the destruction, not the secret they had left untouched. And so, reluctantly, grimly, but with a strange kind of fatalistic calm, the saboteurs prepared themselves for the second act of their night's work. They moved with greater care than before, looping around the perimeter of the base, crouching low where the dunes gave them shelter, stopping often to let patrols pass or to let the light of flares fade. The flames in the heart of the airfield worked both for and against them. The chaos drew many Germans inward, shouting orders, dragging hoses, desperate to salvage what they could from the inferno. But it also cast long shadows and filled the air with smoke that choked the lungs and stung the eyes. To move through, it was like crawling into the mouth of the beast, but they had no choice. Their target lay at the farthest end of the field, where the glow of fire was less violent, but the concentration of guards seemed unnervingly tight. Hargreaves carried with him a canvas satchel filled with stolen documents from the command hut, papers hastily gathered but potentially invaluable. Every step he took reminded him of the weight he carried, of the knowledge pressed into thin sheets that could change the course of battles. Yet even that was secondary now. If Mallory was right about the aircraft, then those documents were only part of the puzzle. The thought of capturing something that might represent the next generation of Luftwaffe power was enough to justify the insanity of their return. Fraser, on the other hand, cursed under his breath with every yard they crawled, his sardonic humor laced with something darker, a recognition that while the first part of the raid had been brilliant, this part might be their undoing. Still, he followed. They all followed, for desert soldiers learn early that loyalty is the only compass worth trusting when the sands threaten to swallow everything else. As they drew closer, the outline of the strange aircraft became clearer. It was larger than the Messerschmitts, with wings that swept at an angle not common for the time, its fuselage sleek yet heavier, almost predatory in its stance. There was an air of menace about it, as if it belonged not to the present but to some darker future. Mallory could not shake the thought that this was more than just a prototype, that perhaps it was a weapon conceived in desperation by a Reich already straining against the tide of war. Whatever it was, it could not be left in enemy hands. The captain gestured for the men to spread out, to encircle the area with the same patience of hunters closing on dangerous prey. The Germans guarding the aircraft were alert, too alert, their movements sharp, their eyes restless, rifles clutched tightly even amid the chaos elsewhere. Mallory counted at least 10 men, perhaps more in the shadows, and he knew that a direct assault would be suicide. Yet war is rarely won by strength alone, and he trusted in the guile that had carried them this far. Slowly, carefully, he signaled Fraser to create a diversion near the burning fuel depot. The Scot slipped away, moving with surprising grace for a man built like iron, and moments later a new explosion rocked the far side of the base as another cache of ammunition went up in flames. The Germans turned, shouts filling the air, some sprinting toward the new disaster, and in that brief window the saboteurs moved. They cut down the remaining guards swiftly, knives flashing in the shadows, muffled grunts swallowed by the roar of fire. It was brutal work, the kind that never left a man's conscience, but in war conscience was a luxury they could not afford. When the last guard fell, the aircraft stood before them, its skin gleaming under the moonlight like some monstrous creature unearthed from the sands. Mallory approached it slowly, running his hand along the cold metal, feeling the weight of history pressing against his palm. Inside this machine was knowledge, design, perhaps even secrets that could tilt the balance of the desert campaign. But just as the men began to prepare charges to destroy it, a sound broke through the night that froze them in place, the whine of engines coming to life. Somewhere deeper in the base, another aircraft was being started, its propellers cutting the smoky air, the roar growing louder with every second. Mallory realized with a chill that the Germans were not merely defending this one machine, they were preparing to fly another. Perhaps it was the twin of the one before them, perhaps something even worse. But whatever it was, if it took to the skies tonight, their mission would mean nothing. The saboteurs exchanged glances, their faces lit by the flickering flames, each man silently understanding what must come next. They could not simply destroy the aircraft before them. They would have to stop the one preparing for flight, no matter the cost. The desert around them trembled with the thunder of engines, the flames rising higher, the night alive with chaos. And in the heart of it all, Mallory felt the weight of choice pressing down upon him. Split his men and risk losing everything, or drive forward together into the teeth of danger. The aircraft before them was silent, still, a beast chained by guards now slain, but its twin, or perhaps its shadow, was waking, and with it came the promise of death from above. The men braced themselves, gripping their weapons, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide, as the first flicker of propeller blade caught the moonlight across the base. Mallory tightened his grip on the detonator, the future balanced on the edge of decision, and for one eternal moment the desert seemed to pause once again, waiting to see who would claim the night. The desert is a strange stage for war. for it has no walls to echo the sound of gunfire, no forest to swallow the steps of men, only an endless horizon that reflects every act back into eternity. That night, as the flames still clawed at the sky and the smell of burning fuel thickened into an almost suffocating haze, Edward Mallory felt the silence beneath the roar. It was the silence of choices about to be made, choices that carried the weight of more than just the handful of men at his side, but of entire armies waiting in the shadows of this continent. The new explosion Fraser had triggered had bought them a heartbeat of time, but it was a heartbeat already fading. For across the airfield, the unmistakable whine of a propeller deepened into a growl, a signal that one of the Luftwaffe's experimental machines was being coaxed to life. Every man there understood without words that if the Germans managed to lift that aircraft into the night sky, then the blood and fire they had already spilled would be nothing more than a prelude to disaster. Mallory had always believed that leadership was not about barking orders or stamping authority into the dust, but about carrying the burden of decisions so heavy that no other man would willingly shoulder them. He looked into the faces of his comrades, Fraser with his crooked half-smile that masked fatigue, Hargreaves clutching the satchel of stolen papers like a relic that might justify their suffering, young Collins who had hardly spoken a word since they left Tobruk, but whose eyes now burned with a strange, determined fire, and he felt the weight of them all pressing into his bones. To split the group meant dividing their fragile strength. To charge together meant throwing themselves headlong into the teeth of a machine that had already begun to shake the earth with its rising power. Yet hesitation was the truest enemy of all, and so Mallory made his choice with the quiet certainty of a man who had long ago given up the illusion of safety. He signaled Collins and Fraser to remain with the strange grounded aircraft, to plant explosives along its wings and fuselage, to make certain that even if none of them returned, this ghost of German ambition would never haunt the skies. The rest, himself included, would move toward the thunder of the living machine, through smoke and light, carrying not only rifles but the bitter resolve that had driven them this far. The men did not argue. War had burned the habit of questioning out of them, replacing it with the rhythm of trust, and so they moved as one, sliding back into the currents of chaos like shadows carried on the wind. The closer they came to the source of the noise, the thicker the smoke became, blinding them, stinging their eyes, filling their mouths with the acrid taste of burning fuel. Shapes loomed suddenly and dissolved just as quickly, half-destroyed hangars, twisted barrels, the crumpled wings of planes already gutted by flame. And through it all, the sound grew louder, a steady rhythm of blades slicing the night, a machine demanding to rise. Mallory's mind flicked back, just for an instant, to the air battles over Crete, to the desperate scramble of men running across airstrips while the Luftwaffe descended like hawks. He remembered the helplessness of watching friends cut from the sky by machines faster and deadlier than their own, and he knew that whatever prototype waited ahead could not be allowed to repeat that story across Africa's burning sands. When they reached the edge of a low hangar wall, the sight before them froze even their battle-hardened nerves. The aircraft, bathed in a hellish glow of fire, looked almost unreal. Its wings were sleek, angled differently from the familiar Messerschmitts, its nose elongated, the canopy glinting like an insect's eye. Around it, a frenzy of German ground crew worked feverishly, shouting to one another in clipped voices, their movements desperate and hurried. They were not merely performing routine duty, Mallory realized. They were fighting against time, as if they too knew that the sands of fate were slipping through their fingers. The saboteurs crouched low, weapons ready, and for a moment it seemed possible that they might unleash a storm of bullets, cut the crew down before the machine could breathe. But then came the unmistakable shift of air, the propellers gathering strength, the fuselage shuddering as power coursed into its veins. To fire now would only alert the entire base, draw down a hurricane of rifles before they could cripple the beast. No, this would require precision, timing, and a willingness to step closer to death than any of them had yet dared. Mallory pointed toward the undercarriage, where the wheels still gripped the earth. A charge there would cripple the machine before it could leave the ground, grounding it permanently. Hargreaves nodded grimly, slipping a small explosive from his kit, and began to crawl forward, each inch a battle against the open ground and the merciless eyes of German soldiers. The others provided what little cover they could, watching the crew scurry about the cockpit, watching the pilot climb into his seat, his silhouette sharp against the firelit smoke. Every second stretched unbearably, time itself bending around the slow crawl of one man with the fate of nations pressing on his shoulders. Then it happened, as it always does in war. The plan collided with chaos. A German mechanic turned suddenly, his gaze falling directly upon the creeping form of Hargreaves, his voice rising in alarm. Shouts erupted, rifles swung, and the illusion of stealth shattered into gunfire. The saboteurs unleashed their own storm in response, bullets crackling through the night, men falling in the flickering light of the flames. Hargreaves, hit but not broken, hurled himself beneath the aircraft, slamming the charge against the wheel strut with the last reserves of his strength. And when the blast tore through the machine's undercarriage, the scream of twisted metal drowned even the roar of the engine. The plane lurched, its nose dipping, its wings shuddering, the pilot clawing at controls that no longer answered. But victory was never so simple. The explosion had crippled the prototype, yes, but it had also drawn the fury of the Germans upon them. Soldiers poured from the shadows, rifles flashing, grenades arcing through smoke. The saboteurs were driven back against the burning skeleton of a hangar, each man firing until his rifle clicked empty, each heartbeat a borrowed miracle. Mallory felt the sting of a graze across his arm, saw Collins stagger under the shock of shrapnel, heard Fraser's distant curse still carrying through the smoke as he worked on the charges for the other aircraft. They were being crushed by numbers, swallowed by the tide, and still the captain knew they had not yet fulfilled the promise of their mission. The crippled aircraft smoldered but did not yet burn. Its secrets, its blueprints of steel and wire, remained intact. Mallory understood in that terrible clarity, which comes only in moments of life and death, that destruction was no longer enough. If they could not carry this machine away, they must at least carry a piece of it, some fragment of knowledge that could tell the Allies what they faced. His eyes darted toward the cockpit, shattered but still gleaming, and he knew with a certainty that chilled his blood that he must reach it, no matter what storm raged around him. As bullets chewed into the sand, as fire rolled across the wreckage, as the desert sky trembled under the violence of men and machines, Mallory made his decision. He would break cover, cross the killing ground, and tear from that cockpit whatever secrets it still held. If he fell, the others would carry what he found. If he lived, perhaps history itself would remember that on one terrible night in the summer of 1942, in the burning sands of North Africa, a handful of men defied the tide of war. And yet, as he braced himself for the dash, as he drew the last breath of smoke-thick air and steadied his racing heart, Mallory caught a flicker of movement above the flames. Another shadow, another machine, one he had not seen before, lifting slowly into the night sky on the farthest edge of the airfield. The line between survival and destruction is always razor-thin in war. Yet in that moment, as Edward Mallory fixed his eyes upon the cockpit of the crippled prototype, the balance seemed to teeter in the enemy's favor. For through the thick smoke and the wild arcs of tracer fire there emerged the undeniable truth that another aircraft had indeed slipped past their notice and was now rising with grim determination into the night sky. It was not simply the shadow of a machine leaving the ground. It was the specter of defeat, the knowledge that even with the chaos they had unleashed and the charges they had set, the enemy still possessed the power to turn disaster into opportunity. For an instant, Mallory felt the kind of suffocating weight that presses on a man when he realizes the futility of his struggle. Yet almost immediately it hardened into resolve, for resignation was a luxury denied to those who carried not only their own fates, but also the fate of countless others who depended on their success. The Germans pressed harder now, their rifles crackling relentlessly, their shouts mingling with the roar of engines and the deafening crack of ammunition igniting in the flames. Mallory's men clung to the shattered frame of the hangar as though it were the last island in a sea of fire, returning bursts of fire wherever a silhouette revealed itself. Yet it was plain to all of them that their position could not be held for long. Collins bled from a wound along his side, pale but silent, clutching his weapon with a determination that belied his years. Hargreaves lay half-conscious, his sacrifice having crippled the aircraft but costing him dearly, his breath shallow as he muttered fragments of words no one could quite catch, and Fraser, somewhere beyond the curtain of smoke, was still at work setting the final charges on the other grounded prototype. Each second he bought with his labor measured against the storm, closing in upon his comrades. Mallory knew that waiting meant death, and so with emotion as much instinct as calculation, he broke from cover, sprinting through a rain of bullets toward the crippled aircraft. The world collapsed into fragments of sensation. The sting of hot air against his face, the bite of gravel beneath his boots, the sudden explosion of sparks as a bullet tore into the fuselage beside him. Yet somehow he reached the machine, his hands grasping the cold edge of the cockpit, his body heaving as he pulled himself upward into the smoke-filled cavity. Inside, the stench of fuel and burnt wiring stung his lungs, but more important than the discomfort was the sight that greeted him. A control panel marked with dials and inscriptions unlike those of any standard Luftwaffe machine he had encountered before, blueprints and diagrams shoved into a leather folder behind the pilot's seat, a logbook filled with neat German script that hinted at months of development. This was no mere experiment hastily thrown into battle. This was the culmination of careful, secretive work, and if its secrets could be deciphered, they might reveal the shape of future battles long before they unfolded. He stuffed what he could into his pack, tearing free maps, charts, and sheets of technical notes, knowing there was no time for discrimination, only for speed. Yet as he turned to leap from the cockpit, a shadow fell across him, and in that instant he recognized the unmistakable outline of a German officer, his pistol leveled, his face twisted in fury. For a frozen heartbeat, the two men locked eyes, and Mallory felt the strange clarity of war, that terrible intimacy where enemies see not uniforms but the raw essence of one another, two men caught in the same storm, forced into opposition by the machinery of nations. The pistol rose, the finger tightened, and Mallory braced himself, but then the desert itself intervened. A thunderous explosion erupted from the far side of the base where Fraser's charges had finally ignited, and the shockwave hurled both men to the ground, tearing the weapon from the officer's grasp and buying Mallory a chance that no strategy could have engineered. He staggered free, lungs burning, ears ringing, clutching the pack of stolen documents as if it were life itself. Around him, chaos reigned, Germans scrambling in disarray, flames leaping higher, ammunition detonating in a relentless chorus, and above it all the sound of that second aircraft gathering height, lifting into the desert sky like a hawk breaking from its perch. The sight struck him with bitter finality. No matter what they had done, at least one of these machines had survived, and already its wings were carrying it into the night where pursuit was impossible. Yet even as despair nipped at the edges of his mind, Mallory understood that perhaps victory was not always measured in what one destroyed, but in what one carried away. The documents pressed against his chest might prove more valuable than the wreckage of a dozen planes, for they were knowledge, and knowledge in war is a weapon sharper than any blade. He stumbled back toward his men, bullets still chasing him through the smoke, and found Fraser at last, his face blackened with soot, his clothes torn, but his eyes alight with a savage satisfaction. The charges had done their work. The second grounded prototype was reduced to a burning husk, its twisted skeleton collapsing into the sand. Two of the machines were gone, their promise to the Reich extinguished, yet the third, the one now vanishing into the sky, remained a specter of unfinished business. Still, there was no time to grieve over what could not be changed. The base was in uproar, reinforcements flooding in, and already the noose of German rifles was tightening around them. Survival depended now on escape, and escape alone. The men gathered what strength they had left, dragging Hargreaves between them, pushing Collins forward despite his bleeding, and together they slipped once more into the desert night, using the chaos behind them as cover. Every step was agony, every breath a battle, but the dunes received them like old friends, swallowing their figures into the shifting sands, hiding them from the eyes of the enemy. Behind them, the airfield blazed like a second sun, its flames a signal to anyone who might be watching miles away that something extraordinary had unfolded, something the desert itself might whisper of long after the war had moved on. Yet even as they put distance between themselves and the inferno, Mallory could not shake the image of that aircraft rising into the sky, its dark silhouette etched against the burning horizon. It was not just a machine. It was a promise, a warning, perhaps even a curse. He carried the documents now, heavy against his back, but he also carried the knowledge that the war had revealed yet another secret, one that would not rest until it had claimed its due. And so, though his men staggered with exhaustion, though the desert stretched ahead in merciless silence, though the line between victory and death blurred with every step, the captain's mind burned with the same unrelenting question. Would the stolen papers prove enough to counter the shadow that had just taken flight? Or had they merely traded one fire for another, darker flame waiting beyond the horizon? The desert does not welcome fugitives, nor does it readily grant passage to those who stumble from fire into shadow. And as Mallory and his small band of weary saboteurs pushed farther into the vast expanse of sand, they discovered with brutal clarity that victory within the confines of an enemy airfield was only the beginning of their trial. Behind them, the blaze of the ruined hangars still painted the horizon with a crimson stain, an unnatural sunrise in the dead of night. And though distance eventually muffled the crackle of ammunition and the shouts of disoriented German soldiers, the lingering scent of smoke seemed to chase them across the dunes, reminding each man with every breath that they had torn open the heart of an enemy's stronghold and would be hunted with relentless precision until either capture or the desert itself claimed them. The sand underfoot shifted like treachery, dragging at their boots, while above them the stars glittered with cruel indifference, countless witnesses to human struggle, yet offering no comfort beyond their cold light. Fraser, though grimly satisfied with the havoc he had wrought, staggered under the weight of his exertion, His hands blistered and blackened from the detonators he had primed in haste, and yet he pressed forward as though the explosion still rang in his ears, urging him onward through sheer momentum. Collins, his uniform soaked with blood from the wound in his side, bit down on his pain until it became a dull rhythm that matched his steps, refusing to slow the column with complaints, for he knew as clearly as the others that hesitation meant death. Hargreaves, born between Mallory and Fraser in a makeshift sling of torn fabric, drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring half-formed words that might have been prayers or delirious recollections of home, and though his body weighed heavily on the others, no thought was given to abandoning him, for such a betrayal would have stained the mission more deeply than any enemy bullet. Mallory alone seemed to carry not only his own weariness but also the invisible weight of command, for within the pack on his shoulders rested the documents torn from the cockpit, a fragile salvation that could tilt the balance of the war if delivered, yet a burden that transformed him from a mere officer into the custodian of knowledge whose importance could not be measured in lives alone. The desert tested him with every step, whispering temptations of surrender as thirst clawed at his throat and exhaustion gnawed at his limbs, but his resolve remained iron, for he could not allow the sacrifice of his men, nor the ruin of the airfield, to dissolve into futility. The prototype that had risen into the night remained etched in his mind like a scar, its silhouette a reminder that their work was not complete, that the enemy's vision had not been extinguished but merely delayed, and thus the stolen intelligence became both prize and curse, hope and burden, a riddle that only the passage of time could unravel. By the time dawn began to bleed across the horizon, staining the sky with pale ribbons of light, their bodies were hollowed shells, stumbling forward in a rhythm that no longer resembled walking so much as the slow collapse of men who had given more than flesh was meant to yield. Yet the desert, indifferent though it seemed, had not entirely abandoned them. The dunes shifted to reveal a scattering of rocks, and within their shadow they discovered a narrow wadi, its floor hard and cool, a place where they might find concealment from the searching eyes of enemy patrols. They collapsed into its embrace with a kind of exhausted reverence, drinking what little remained in their canteens, bandaging wounds with strips of cloth, and resting their heads against stone that radiated the chill of night even as the sun rose higher. In that brief respite, as the world shrank to the sound of ragged breathing and the faint rustle of sand carried on the wind, Mallory allowed himself the dangerous luxury of thought. The documents, spread briefly before him in the dim light, revealed glimpses of ambition that unsettled even his battle-hardened composure, sketches of engines designed to lift heavier loads at higher speeds, notes on alloys resistant to heat and stress, diagrams of armaments that could turn an aircraft into a predator unlike any they had yet faced. It was a language of calculation and cold precision, yet beneath it pulsed the feverish drive of men determined to reshape the war in their favor. And as Mallory traced the lines with his finger, he felt both dread and urgency, for here was proof that the Reich was not content to defend its conquest but sought to bend the future to its will through invention. The fire they had lit on that airfield was, in truth, only the spark of a larger conflagration, one that could sweep across continents if unchecked. Sleep came fitfully, broken by visions of flames and the echo of engines rising into the night, and when the sun was high, its merciless light pouring into the wadi, they rose again and pushed onward, driven less by strength than by necessity. Hours blurred into one another, each step a battle, each dune a mountain, until at last, as the second night descended, they glimpsed in the distance the faint shimmer of signal fires, British patrols marking their position for returning units. Relief mingled with disbelief. They had carried themselves across the desert's judgment, sustained by stubborn defiance and the unyielding knowledge that what they bore could alter the very shape of the war. When at last they staggered into the embrace of their own lines, greeted by astonished comrades who scarcely recognized their smoke-blackened faces, Mallory surrendered the documents with hands that trembled not from doubt but from exhaustion, his voice hoarse yet steady as he reported the destruction of 2 prototypes and the survival of a third. The intelligence officers who received the bundle spoke in hushed tones, their eyes alight with the gravity of what had been salvaged, and though Mallory stood silent, allowing others to measure the worth of what he had delivered, he knew in the marrow of his bones that the true weight of the mission would be revealed only in the months to come. When the Reich unveiled its next gambit, and the Allies countered not by surprise, but by foreknowledge wrested from the burning heart of an airfield in the African night. For now, though, as he looked upon his men, Collins bandaged but alive, Fraser grinning despite blistered hands, Hargreaves clinging stubbornly to life, Mallory felt a surge of pride that washed away the bitterness of unfinished destruction. They had endured the desert's judgment, outpaced the fury of their enemies, and carried with them the fragile weapon of knowledge. Yet even as relief settled like dust upon weary shoulders, the silhouette of that lone prototype haunted his mind, a shadow across the stars that no fire could erase. The mission was over, but the war, vast and insatiable, stretched on before them, and he understood with crystalline certainty that what they had done was not an ending, but merely the opening move in a longer, harsher struggle where courage, sacrifice, and resolve would be demanded again and again until the final reckoning was at last delivered.